Hi, good evening. My name is Rick Napier, and I'm guest chairing this broadcast on behalf of the Palestine Return Centre. And a great pleasure for me to do that for them, but also because of the guests that we have with us tonight. Nerdine Kiswani is extremely ill. She trudged her way to the camera tonight to take part, but it was quite clear she was very ill, and we've postponed that pleasure till a future date. But we do have two guests tonight. Jerry Carroll is coming in from Belfast and Leah Levain from London. Jerry is a member of the Assembly in Northern Ireland for People Before Profit, and like Leah, a long-term dedicated campaigner on the issue of Palestine. Leah Levain was is co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour, and for her pains was expelled from the Labour Party, and according to some reports, frog marched out of the building as a threat to Starmer's Labour Party. And Leah also is a long-term campaigner and will speak tonight with Jerry to the topic: what difference does international politics, international policies make to working for Palestine Solidarity on the ground in London, Palestine, Belfast, or Scotland? Jerry, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Would you like to kick off?
Yeah, Mick, thanks for having me, and nice to be here. And solidarity to Leah as well. I don't get the chance to say it in this meeting. Solidarity to her and everybody under the boot of Stormers sort of clampdown of activists. I suppose really a couple of points I wanted to make. And the first point is, I mean, obviously the World Cup is on, I think, at the moment, if I'm correct, England are hopefully getting defeated very soon by Wales. But in the general backdrop of the World Cup, there's obviously been a lot of talk about human rights in Qatar generally. And sort of my and People Before Profit's position would be that we should be talking about human rights in the run-up and during every single World Cup, be that Argentina, 1978, under a military dictatorship, and the dirty war that took place there, or in Russia, which happened 4 years ago, and the many human rights abuses there, or indeed in the World Cup in America in 4 years' time with the horrible human rights of the American government, be that in terms of invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, or its rollback of abortion rights in its own country. I think we'll have to be consistent, and I posed the question: are we only allowed to suggest or talk about a boycott if it's not in the US or the biggest military state in the world? So I think we should obviously use that situation, and I think generally speaking, we would support every effort across every country to support the mass of ordinary people to protest against bigotry, corrupt states, and wealth hoarding by the ruling class, whether it's in Qatar, America, or wherever else. But I think there is a huge level of hypocrisy here at play, and the glaring obvious point is that it can be suggested, it can be thrown out that people should boycott Qatar, and this is kind of a somewhat of a talking point in the media. But the glaring and obvious point is when you talk about Israel, about boycotting Israel because of its ongoing human rights abuses, and as Amnesty International themselves have stated, it's apartheid practice. We're told it's completely off limits, that anti-Semitic and other such slanders are thrown at people who sort of suggest this train of thought. So we obviously have, I'm sure people on the meeting either don't. We have no faith in this sort of Western version of human rights promoted by the likes of the US and the UK and other countries. But I think we should use some of this recent language about human rights and about boycott to say that we should not be, our governments, our states should not be endorsing this political system which denies human rights on a basic daily basis to Palestinians, which allows them to be massacred and which actually promotes this Israeli state as a normal state and the only democracy in the Middle East, when it's absolutely not the case. And obviously, when you look at the situation faced by Palestinians, you sometimes can't imagine things getting any worse. You can't imagine the nature of the Israeli state becoming more aggressive. You cannot imagine it becoming more racist and more anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian in its views and policies. And unfortunately, in some ways, we've seen the current situation develop in that way, with Ben-Gvir being appointed as the National Security Minister. Not only do we have a long history of him supporting racism generally and settler racism towards Palestinians, but obviously in recent days calling for the execution of Palestinian leaders, leading settlers into Hebron to attack Palestinian lands and homes, and also trying to instigate mobs in Sheikh Jarrah and East Jerusalem, and obviously support the settlers kicking out Palestinians, trying to advocate using guns if people dare to use rocks to protest, to resist against the settlers for kicking them out of their family homes. And in some ways, obviously, his grotesque, horrible, racist, reactionary policies and views and statements has always been the history, pretty much from day one, of the Israeli state, with a state that has institutionalized racism, has systematically discriminated against Palestinians, and obviously, really, what he does by uttering this kind of nonsense and horrible reactionary bigoted views is in some ways blow apart the liberal veneer that the Western world has wrapped Israel around for many, many, many years, many decades. I would argue he's a grotesque public face of what the Israeli state represents, but has always been about. And obviously, we should never ignore the sort of daily impact of Palestinians facing checkpoints, harassment, stop and search, and being killed on the regular. But also, I think we should at the same time recognize the huge crisis that the Israeli state itself is in terms of not being able to form a government, instability, elections happening on a regular, and obviously, public figures like Ben-Gvir, people like that, unfortunately, maybe come to the fore, which is obviously terrible in terms of people being elected, having those type of politics, but also exposing the reality of the Israeli state, the nature of it, to people who maybe have illusions in it or see it as a complex situation when it obviously absolutely is not. And obviously, I think most Israeli politicians would eventually, I think, hope to annex the settlements, yet obviously seizing land permanently threatens more Palestinians inside the Israeli borders and the Israeli state itself. And this sort of contradiction is a circle that cannot be squared. There's all sorts of medium, short, and long-term problems and crises for the Israeli state and the Israeli ruling class more generally. The state, obviously, in its view, needs the land to expand its settlements and ultimately population, but it cannot forcibly evict millions of Palestinians from their land as much as they would obviously like to, as the history of Nakba and everything every year between and after that shows. So that obviously is not to say, therefore, that we should just sit back and wait for the crisis to develop and get worse. Absolutely not. People living under apartheid and occupation obviously cannot afford this in terms of their life and their daily life, and their situation will not tolerate that. But also, I think it should present us with some kind of hope in a very difficult and often bleak situation, which it is for Palestinians. We can expect, I think, new situations to hopefully emerge. I'm hopeful that we can see more and more people speak out who didn't speak out years ago. Maybe more people to join solidarity events who wouldn't have many or several years ago. And I think that's quite important. So see, in a very bleak situation with the new government being installed, that there's, I think, in some ways hope, because the truth will come to the fore, and our job is to expose that and to obviously argue against any repression and killing and so on and so forth. I think also as well, I think next year we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, and I think we need to be honest about the situation that obviously Palestinians have said this themselves, but speaking of somebody here to bring solidarity, speak about the truth and the real situation that we're in, the Palestinians are in, as a result of the Oslo Accords being implemented. In the north of Ireland, we're entering a maybe similar or different in many ways anniversary next year of the Good Friday Agreement. And we're taught in mainstream parlance in the north that this agreement was all about keeping peace between the two communities in the north, that is between Catholics and Protestants. When in actual fact this agreement itself institutionalized sectarianism, and there's a whole level of instability of its own kind in the north happening at the moment. And I think when you come to talk about the Oslo Accords, I think we need to see them as not the deal, the agreement that brought peace, but ultimately the agreement that paved the way for a rapid increase in the building of settlements, the rapid increase for stealing land of Palestinians, and obviously leaving apartheid untouched and making the possibility, and even the possibility of a nation state for Palestinians even more and more unlikely. So I think we have to categorically say these kind of things, even if it may be difficult to talk about them, but it's about saying things honestly and upfront. I think from our perspective and People Before Profit, we say that we categorically cannot reform a settler, colonial, racist apartheid state. It has to be ultimately torn down. And Oslo obviously has refused the right of millions of Palestinians who've been exiled from Nakba and afterwards to return. And we shouldn't settle for an agreement or a situation that sees millions of Palestinians locked into misery, poverty, and ultimately under the boot of the Israeli state. We should also, I think, recognize, and another point, recognize the role that Israel plays in relation to empire and imperialism in the region and across the world historically, and also today. Obviously, people will be familiar with Ronald Storrs, the former British general of Jerusalem, who stated that the goal of the British government was to create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. He said that in 1917. And that was obviously quite telling about the British government's attitude towards both Ireland and Palestine. It's not exactly the same, but there's obviously historical similarities in many different ways. Britain wanted to use both countries or parts of the north, I suppose, parts of Ireland, to further the interests of the British Empire and capitalism more generally, and really thwart, in some cases, actually execute any radical independence campaign or campaigners. And in that context, they relied on mistruths and falsehoods to promote their reason for funneling hundreds of millions of pounds into the really paramilitary organizations, obviously, and the sectarian murder gangs in the 20s before the state was set up in the north. So obviously they promoted the lie and supported the lie that Palestine was empty, supported that Zionist lie, ignoring thousands of years of history of irrigation, farming, and everything, art, everything, and bought into that Zionist lie, even though many of those heads of state themselves in Britain were complete racist and anti-Semites. And obviously in the north of Ireland, a sectarian state was created to promote the interests of empire, to stop any attempt at radical or even moderate independence taking place. And I think the important point to make there's a longer talk to tease those similarities out, but I think both states are not going away, not completely disappearing, but fracturing under immense pressure for all sorts of different regional but also historical reasons. They cannot in many ways deliver what they said and were set out to the north of Ireland is no longer a majority Protestant state, despite being set up to do one. And obviously, there's all sorts of tensions, dynamics that Israel is facing with, which I think presents possibilities for change on a huge level. And I think we should draw lessons and strength and struggle from each other on an international basis to try and do so. Just a couple other points. We obviously have across the world, but in Ireland as well, huge solidarity and support for Palestinians. People, draw those direct historical examples, and people also just see the grotesque bombing and massacring every year, more or less now, in a public sense, and they take their streets in big numbers. And for us and People Before Profit, we see our role as organising and supporting those demonstrations, and many of our leading members, our elected reps, myself and others across the island, play a key role in organising, supporting, attending, and taking part in those protests. We're also seeing an interesting dynamic in many ways in the south of Ireland, that Sinn Féin is rising as the biggest party. And again, that's maybe a longer meeting in and of itself, but Sinn Féin obviously talks a good talk in many ways, and does attend and organise protests in support of Palestine, but also has a contradictory role where it's been sort of recently uncritical of NATO, historically quite close to the US state in terms of people like George Bush and others, and I think they obviously have an important role to play in a potential future government. They could lead a future government in the south of Ireland, and I think they need to be playing a fundamental role to say, not only do we recognise the Palestinians have a right to resist and fight back, but we will not be standing for or supporting the US's role in funding Israel, and publicly saying that. And also, we will not allow the Shannon Airport in the south of Ireland to be used as a military stop-off point for the US Army. So I think we can use the current or the development context, I suppose, in Ireland to further the cause for liberation and solidarity with Palestine. And also, I think we should be saying quite publicly, in a cost of living crisis, we're in a situation where in other parts of the UK at the north are still waiting on payments coming through for people to afford to heat their homes. We cannot, in that situation, afford, literally, financially, to fund the tune of billions of pounds every year, and dollars in the case of the US, fund the Israeli state. So that should come to an end. And obviously, as people will know, without the funding of the US and Britain and other states, the Israeli government and state would absolutely fundamentally collapse. So finally, I just say, our perspective is from the river to the sea. Palestine should be free. I think we need to see another intifada, another uprising, mass uprising of ordinary people, obviously in Palestine, but also across the Middle East and frankly the world, to make sure that people can live in dignity and freedom. And that means obviously fundamentally in all those struggles, to make sure the Palestinian cause and struggle is front and centre. So that's me for now, but thanks for listening to me and thanks for having me tonight.
Thanks, Jerry. Very clear and concise. And it leaves about 20 wonderful questions that we'll come back to with you later. Leah, are you there?
I don't know where I am now. Yes, here I am. Hi.
You are. You're trying to sneak off for a cup of tea while Jerry was talking. Leah,
intently.
Leah, you're co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour. I just saw a reminder today that the Scottish Government once called on companies in Scotland not to invest in the settlements. I mean, it's hardly a radical position. It was quite timid. But the Board of Deputies up in Scotland are called SCOJEC, Scottish Council of Jewish Communities. They said that policy was as anti-Semitic as desecrating a synagogue. What do you think about that hysteria? And how do you see the way forward, given that Starmer's Inquisition is expelling Jews and others from the Labour Party?
Well, that wasn't what I'd prepared particularly, but I'll answer that briefly and then talk about some other things. But yes, that is the thing that the Scottish Government said. That is the sort of hysteria that is that we get. And as you say, a very modest demand. It wasn't boycotting Israel. It certainly wasn't boycotting Jews. It was boycotting the settlements, which, as I'm sure everyone listening today knows, are illegal under international law. It is what we contend with all the time. I didn't particularly want to go into the sorry saga of Starmer's Labour Party, but I will refer in my talk to what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and all of us as left-wing people. And it relates to some of the points that Jerry was referring to. So when I was asked to speak, if that's all right, Mick, but do come back and challenge me if you want to. She did ask me to go into a little bit around the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, so-called working definition of anti-Semitism, which has just served to make our lives more difficult. And I do want to say, and I think I will get to it, that I get pretty fed up, and I know that Palestinians get pretty fed up with having anti-Semitism thrown at them and at us every time we raise the issue of Palestinian rights, the most basic justice for Palestinians. But we do have to address it. And the whole reason Jewish Voice for Labour got set up was to defend the left in the Labour Party against these fake charges of anti-Semitism. And just as an aside, we do believe, and our research will tell us, although it's not huge numbers, that Jewish people have been disproportionately disciplined by the Labour Party for being anti-Semitic. It is actually that bizarre. So the IHRA definition itself, I'll read you the heading of it because I won't go into great detail. It's not that long. It is meaningless. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. I don't even really understand what it means. And believe me, I've had to study in some distance. It literally doesn't make sense. What is wrong with the dictionary definition, which says hatred, something like hatred of Jews as Jews? It might say discrimination. Now, of course, the most heinous part is that there are 11 examples of what actually in the writing says, which may serve as indication of anti-Semitism, but in practice always serve to mean anti-Semitism. The most heinous bit of it is the one that says denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And I don't want to get over pedantic, but to say that a state of Israel is a racist endeavor is saying that Zionism, it's a way of, on paper, it's like resisting the call that says Zionism is racism, which I think is a debatable thing. But when we're actually talking about, I do think there's an argument in favor of that, but I don't think that was the intention of most original Zionists and many people who support Zionism, understandably in despair after centuries of oppression. But what we're actually talking about is not an abstract state of Israel, but the actual living reality of the state of Israel. And again, I don't hardly need to tell this audience, and Jerry has gone into some of the details about what's actually happening for Palestinians. I'm in regular touch with the family in Gaza and many people in the South Hebron Hills. And again, many of you will know what's happening in the South Hebron Hills in the Masafa Yatta, just constant sort of demolitions and so on. And that's just one of the things that are going on. You've mentioned BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and I think Jerry did as well. We are in the situation now in the UK where a bill is being introduced by government to outlaw boycott, divestment and sanctions on the basis that it's anti-Semitism. And I'm sure it's that sort of hysterical reaction that you got from the Scottish Board of Jewish Communities. And when we add that to what else is happening in the UK, they already have passed a completely heinous act to suppress protest. I can go into more details about things that are happening, particularly to environmental protesters. But another of the big targets in that law is Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller communities. Again, I can say more if there are any questions. I think it's important to note that there is criticism of Zionism amongst Jews, and what we then get labeled is sham Jews, which is a phenomenal insult, and worse. I won't. Self-hating and sham are the more polite things. I'm not going to go into any great details. And while it's certainly the case that the majority of Jews in the world support Zionism, the idea of a Jewish state, and even most will support the Jewish state. Well, I take issue with Israel as the Jewish state, but with Israel. But actually, that before the Nazi Holocaust, that wasn't the case. The majority of Jews did not support Zionism, and the majority of working class Jews, who were the very much wiped out Eastern European wise, were actually saying our place is here, wherever they were. And one of the big heroes of the Jewish resistance, Marek Edelman, who was one of the people in the Warsaw Ghetto, who didn't die that long ago, and he never went to Israel, even though they really wanted him to go. And so they didn't come to his funeral and things like that, because he said, my job is to make Poland a safe place for Jews. So I think I've already said about the IHRA definition. When we look at the actual lived experience for Palestinians, that definition actually robs Palestinians of describing their own experience in language that makes sense, like racism and apartheid. But as I say, you all know this. And yeah, before anyone picks me up on this, yes, sometimes people say things that they say are anti-Zionist, but they actually are anti-Semitic. Sometimes it's clumsy and inadvertent, and sometimes it's deliberate. However, no one who wants to criticize us, and there are many, as you know, never look at why that happens. Why do people, I'm not talking malevolent people, but why do people sometimes clumsily conflate Jews and Israel, anti-Semitism, and Zionism and Judaism? Well, Israel claims that all the time. So as an example, during, I think it was it was Operation Cast Lead, but certainly one of the terrible bombardments of Gaza was, because I get a daily email from the Times of Israel, because I think it's quite useful to have a look at the other side. And then you get adverts sometimes, and appeals, which I usually don't look at. But I looked at this one because it was an appeal to raise money for comfort parcels for our brave soldiers in the Israeli Defense Force who were, and I quote, because it's seared on my brain, who were going to go into Gaza for the sake of the state of Israel and on behalf of the Jews of the world. So they claim that they are doing this in my name. And just as I marched against the Iraq war, because that's what they claimed it was what British people wanted. Jewish people, many Jewish people did not want that. And that's putting it mildly. So I should just jump back to the IHRA non-definition, because there is a big danger when we're thinking about the international importance. There's a big danger and a big pressure for the United Nations to adopt that definition. So the British government adopted it in December 2016. I understand, and Jerry can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Irish government have yet to do it and are resisting. And there's some fantastic people in Ireland who are resisting it. This is extremely, extremely worrying, because actually there aren't that many countries that have adopted it, but the pressure to do so is enormous. not many, if you're told this is the international standard for anti-Semitism, nobody wants to be anti-Semitic, or very few people. And so you go, oh, well, I'll adopt it then. And so you've got to counter every argument in ludicrous detail. And still, even when people agree, and I was a local councillor, and again, if people want to know the details, I had terrible trouble. Everybody agreed with me, and it still got voted through. And I got all sorts of stick for abstaining. I didn't even vote against. Another thing I want to say about Israel as a Jewish state and Jews in Israel is there's a real danger of feeding a false narrative. I do not believe that Israel is a Jewish state. I think it is a state for Jews, and there is a difference there. We can go down blind alleys talking about getting angry, as some Jewish people do. Very honorable people like Jeff Halper from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, who's literally put his neck on the line countless times in support of Palestinians, particularly around house demolitions, of course. But many Haredi Jews will also say that. I think it's irrelevant. I don't think the Jewish values, if we say that if we focus on Jewish values, whatever they are, as long as there's a lot of social justice deep in Jewish values, and I get that for religious Jews that might be very hurtful, but only if you see Israel as representative of the Jews, and we're not some homogenous group of people any more than anybody else. It feeds into the idea that we expect Israel to behave better. Israel is doing what states do, and repressive states that were a colonial settler state, however much sympathy one might have for Jews after the horrors of the Holocaust. Nonetheless, what it's done, the Nakba, was a form of a colonial settler colonialism, and it will do what those sorts of states do, which is align itself with whoever's going to support it. So it's very, very happy as a state to stand with people like Bolsonaro, probably very disappointed that Bolsonaro didn't get back in Brazil, very happy to stand with Viktor Orban. These are clear anti-Semites. They don't hide it, but what they're not is anti-Israel, because they want a strong military state in the Middle East. So don't go down that line, resist it, hard as it might be. An example of how much Jews in Israel get conflated by people who think they're supportive of Israel is, Trump got annoyed because he said he was more supportive of Israel than US Jews, United States Jews. It really is crazy at many levels. I don't know how much longer I've got. I wanted to pick up a bit on Jerry's points about the horrendous new coalition in Israel, because at one level there was a very interesting discussion amongst Jewish people in relation to Israel, because there was one school of thought that said it doesn't make any difference, it's same old, because of course under so-called progressive politicians, for the first 30 years or more it was all Labour governments. And yet the experience of Palestinians wasn't, I don't think, substantially better. Now, I think, that there is no question that the Ben Gvir and Smotrich and all those people are significantly worse even than Netanyahu. But it is a question of degree. But the potentially positive thing is the people who say it's not the same old. It's a dramatic difference. And the liberal Zionists, I know that will seem like a contradiction in terms to many of us here, are really panicked about it. And even the British Board of Deputies has raised concern. Now, that is something. I'm not suggesting it's a heavy, but nonetheless. And before I wind up, I wanted to refer to the fact that we mustn't ignore what's been happening in the UK. But what happened to me, what's happened, it doesn't matter in terms of me, but it matters in terms of what the ruling class are willing to do. And I actually think, given the fear of anti-Semitism leading to some other serious forms of oppression, because anti-Semitism is real. We all know that, and it's rising again, but not as you would believe from many of the newspapers from the left, but from the far right. When you get, in Charlottesville, for example, in 2017, white supremacists chanting "Jews will not replace us," who see Jews as in control of everything. We can't pretend that anti-Semitism is something that's finished, but it's not a big issue in the UK, and that's the reality, and we need to be vigilant. But there is a real fear amongst Jewish people, and to whip that up amongst people who are maybe just, survived the Holocaust or were descendants of the Holocaust is sheer wickedness. But they don't care, because they don't care about Jews. This is a complete myth that this hysteria about Labour anti-Semitism is because they're concerned about Jewish people, Jewish communities. And so I simply don't believe that. But what Corbyn's ideas, and again, this isn't saying Jeremy Corbyn was perfect or is perfect, but what Corbyn's ideas said, well, it gave hope to people that there was an alternative, that when there were financial crises, it didn't always have to be the poorer people who paid, and the rich who could get richer and richer. Frankly, he was proposing a relatively mild challenge to neoliberal hegemony. But that was enough to terrify the UK, the ruling class, not only in the UK, but in many, many other countries. And I think the main reasons, this is it's my theory, is that he was firstly against he's against war, he's against the arms trade, he's anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. And logically, and I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn went as far as this, but logically, if you're anti-colonialist, you're anti-capitalist. And that's completely terrifying. And just as an aside, the Jewish Chronicle, through all the panic of so-called anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, the Jewish Chronicle, and you can actually look it up, Google, search for it, actually published something quite serious, I think by an editor, but I won't swear to that, that said the reason the left are anti-Semitic, the reason the left don't like Jews is because they're anti-capitalist. Now, that felt like one of the most anti-Semitic things I'd ever read. Because that's saying all Jews support capitalism. And given how the dreadful things that have happened, it's appalling. Jewish Voice for Labour is part of an international network. We laughingly, semi-jokingly call ourselves Global Jews, but we're officially the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine. And it's Jewish organizations around the world. And thanks to the wonders of Zoom, we actually are able to meet every month. And I'm telling you this as an indication of as one example of international action. It's small, but it does, unfortunately, and it shouldn't, but it does carry weight when Jewish organizations actually make statements, as we have on several issues. We just published, for example, in Germany, some of you may know that, sorry, jumping about a bit, I apologize, but in Germany, actually, they awarded a European Drama Prize to a playwright called Carol Churchill, who had written, again, I think because of Operation Cast Lead, a very short play called 7 Jewish Children, which drew the parallels between the experiences a child might have had under Nazi bombardment or occupation and what Palestinian children living in Gaza would be experiencing during those horrendous bombardments. And of course, that got her, that and the fact that she supported boycott, divestment, sanctions, has got her labeled as anti-Semitic. And they withdrew the prize. They actually gave her a prize and took it away. And the response from our German partner organizations was to have a reading. And if you go onto the Jewish Voice for Labour website, it's only a 10-minute play. They are there. It's very powerful and very moving. And interestingly, and again, Jerry may have something to say about the small Jewish community and the even smaller pro-Palestinian rights Jewish community in Ireland and similarly in New Zealand actually are making more progress than some of the bigger organizations, although there's a bit of a tipping point happening in America, because the Jewish community in America is similar size to that in Israel, and the younger community are really they're not interested in being part of supporting oppression. So actually, Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, have done a lot of work, for example, particularly in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and things like that. So things are changing. Just thinking about the international perspective. So there is a lot of solidarity. The solidarity is growing. I mean, we sometimes feel like there's not enough. There's never enough, and we don't yet turn enough of the power for people. But it is growing. Well, it is. It is growing, and I do think that we can use what's happening in Israel, because actually it will get worse, and that's terrible. But it will get worse because there's always the basis is already there, and it is horrifying people. People are genuinely worried. As one of my colleagues in the international group said, this is fascism on top of apartheid, and it is worrying, as I say, even some of the establishment Jewish organizations. So we can't afford to give up hope. We have to have our own sumud. The Palestinians show us all the way. I think I'll wind up there, but if there's questions about my own experience, Jewish Voice for Labour, or any other issues, the police bill. But oh my God, I listened to some of the people like Claire Daly Ireland in the European Parliament, and I just think, oh, if only we had more of the people like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Question for Jerry and Leah. Jerry could come in first. You talked about the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are headed for senior cabinet posts in Israel, giving control of police forces, paramilitary forces, to intensify the repression. The killing is already escalating last night and so on. On the one hand, you've got that, but on the other hand, you've got, that was Derry that started it in 2006. You started to shut down the Raytheon factory there. And then just a few miles from where Leah is, down in Brighton, they shut down an arms factory that was arming Israel during Cast Lead. And now, of course, just a few days ago, Palestine Action activists who were peacefully attacking arms factories, a jury unanimously found them not guilty. Now, internationally, there's attempts to criminalise what we are doing. I mean, in Scotland, since 2014, no Israeli groups have been able to appear at the Edinburgh International Festival. In Auckland Port, no ships have been unloaded there since 2014. The longshoremen always turn them away. So there's excellent examples of solidarity. There's intensified efforts to repress that IHRA legislation and so on. To what extent do you think the open monstrosity of these new elements in the Israeli government will make it more difficult for even the Tories to continue arming them? And if we continue to try and batter down doors, local authorities, councils, etc., make it a bit easier for us to win the arguments that this state must be boycotted and isolated. Your thoughts, Jerry, and then Leah. No, you're muted.
Sorry, I said something really important there that you missed.
No,
yeah, I think it's a good question, Mick. And I suppose, in a way, I mean, it's obviously you have to first and foremost worry about the people under the boot of this sort of Ben Gvir and Netanyahu and those people obviously are first and foremost mine. I suppose Leah can speak for herself, but our minds as solidarity activists. But I think in terms of being placed in Ireland and sort of these islands, I think it does make it I suppose, easier in a way to expose the true nature of the state. I would pitch it that way. Left has always said about Israel ignoring human rights, and there's been occasionally some organisations publicly, internationally condemning it. But that's happening on a more sort of sped up basis with the likes of Amnesty and other organisations who were maybe historically, frankly, not great on the questions, but are being forced to come out a bit more robust publicly. So I think in a way it should make it easier for us in the West, if you will, to kind of pull away the liberal veneer that has been cloaked around Israel. But I suppose it's for the Tories. I mean, the Tories have no problem defending all sorts of terrible regimes if it's in their interest to further. And I suppose it's the kind of the longer term project of Israel. I mentioned about it furthering the interest of British capitalism and British imperialism. It's more nakedly being a watchdog for the American empire and state in the Middle East, and I suppose that will continue to become important. So I think it's contradictory in many ways, but I suppose the point that we'll also make is that the fact that there's legislation being rushed through in Westminster to criminalise solidarity shows you how terrified the British government is. They want to maintain and fund Israel, obviously, till as long as they can. But the fact they had to rush through legislation means that they are terrified. They literally want to criminalise it because it's being more and more popular. So, in a weird way, I'm not saying we don't want this legislation to go through. Obviously, we'll fight tooth and nail against it. But the fact that they're forced to do something as drastic as that shows you how there has been a shift in the last 5 years around solidarity view and sort of isolating Israel. I suppose that should give us hope, and hopefully by extension hope to people in Palestine.
Leah, the US Congress has got a $1 million fine in the offing in 20 years, I believe, for BDS campaigning. If we were marginal, they wouldn't bother passing laws, would they? What do you think about the prospects for determined BDS and solidarity campaigning in the years ahead, given the general picture that you've both described in the last half hour?
Well, I think Jerry's covered a lot of it, and yes, I'd actually made a note about the US because it's already illegal in several US states. I don't know how many, but quite a few, and it's already created all sorts of problems for individuals. I think that yes, it is a sign of how terrified they are, and I think that we are heading into. Well, as I said, we've got this. They haven't yet passed the BDS bill, but it's not yet law. But the repression of protest is already law. And I say at the moment they seem to be mainly, there have been big marches since that went through, and at the moment they're targeting environmental activists. That's where they see the immediate threat. But if they pass the BDS stuff, I'm trying to imagine, because you can get 10 years for being a nuisance protester. Hasn't yet been tested out, but I mean, I have a colleague, somebody else on the executive of Jewish Voice for Labourers, and been arrested twice with the Just Stop Oil protests, and his conditions of bail are amazing. All these streets he's not allowed to go into, and just awful. So I'm sure when we start campaigning for BDS, particularly in the face of a law out loud, then we'll be the ones where the police will be on the big watching us, ready to pounce. But it will take an enormous amount of state machinery to actually suppress the amount of opposition. I mean, as I can't remember who it was you said about Palestine Action. I mean, they took some huge risks, and I have to say, without naming names, actually a lot of flack from some people who should have been really supportive, and certainly my contacts, and not saying they're extensive, but my own contacts in Palestine, when I told them about this, it really was one of the things that gave them the most hope, that people were prepared to go to that length, and actually shutting down those factories. I mean, they've shut completely one in Oldham, for example, and now that actually the law is saying, well, actually it's fine. So I don't know what will happen, but yeah, it's very, very serious. But I think that I don't know that they've got the capacity to actually suppress us to that degree. But they might do. They might prefer to put huge amount of money into that. they're terrified, frankly.
You don't talk to people active in the field of Palestine for very long before talk turns to the BBC or the media and the way in which the so-called conflict is presented, skewed, twisted, and made as presentable as possible for conservative British ears, conservative with a small c. To what extent do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the NATO developing war against Russia, the micromanagement of the news? I turn on the news every morning to a partly political broadcast from Zelensky. But the absolute, it seemed, I mean, I use the word hesitatingly, the sort of totalitarian control of what we're allowed to know about this very, very dangerous war, possibly, really catastrophic war in Europe. That mentions in with what a lot of people on Palestine Solidarity activity already knew. But there was never a fall from grace, was there? I mean, is it not the case that when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about the control of what ordinary people are allowed to access, it's becoming clearer to a large minority that we need to develop independent organisation, maybe stop complaining to the BBC, okay, I've said it, and begin to develop alternative media. Jerry?
Yeah, I agree on the point of alternative media, but some of the wider points you're talking about there, Mick, first of all, I'm stating our position. We oppose the invasion of Ukraine, oppose Putin. We opposed him when he came as part of the G8 to Fermanagh in the north of Ireland about 8 years ago, whilst Northern Party leaders welcomed him and shook his hand and took pictures with him. We were outside protesting against them. So just to kind of state that from the offset. But it was quite remarkable to see people lauding Zelensky and the Ukrainians' right to resist, in the context of, and I think everybody should have a right to resist defending their home, but obviously there's a wider context of two sides. We're told about Palestine and Israel, it's complex, there's two sides and all this kind of stuff, as if an armed nuclear state is equivalent to a state that obviously doesn't really exist in a real sense. But when you talk about opposing the Russian invasion, but also talking about, can we have a conversation about the role of NATO and circling Russia and giving Putin some kind of justification for his invasion that we should oppose? You're like, you can't do this. You can't talk about the two sides. You're pro Putin. You're against the West and all this kind of crazy ideas. And we've been subject to it by the BBC. Crazy conversations conducted by some sort of presenters in that context. But the point I was making earlier, about Zelensky, right, the armed resistance. You talk about that in Palestinian context. You're accused of being anti-Semite, and also you're accused of being bloodthirsty and all sorts of kind of things. And obviously there's a context of Islamophobia as a backdrop to that. I think it was quite stark to see that comparison not being made around supporting some people's right to resist a empire, and other people's right to definitely not resist an empire, Palestinians. Some people's right to get into Europe. And again, I support any refugee, Ukrainian or any other part of the world, but obviously Palestinian refugees are suspicious in terms of the West. They're obviously still in camps, mostly in Lebanon and Turkey and other kind of places. So I think the contradictions were kind of, or the hypocrisy was stark. But I think it should really force us to be obviously critical of the West's motive as much as we can detest, and I do detest Putin and his regime, but be suspicious of why they're suddenly interested in Ukraine. It's for their own interest. It's to rehabilitate the likes of MI5, is to rehabilitate the likes of the British state and British imperialism itself, which obviously has a rotten, horrible history, but is trying to reinvent itself after the disasters of Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously for the people in those countries, but for the aims of the British of British imperialism itself. So yeah, I think all that kind of underlines the need for, you know, meetings like this, but also I think more radical and independent media and voices being propelled.
Yeah, standing up against what's happening in Israel, Palestine, you're always going to be repressed now, you know, it's not something new. Every anti-colonial movement has faced domestic repression, does it not? Your comments?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and there are times when I must feel very, well, I certainly feel depressed sometimes, but that's not very useful. You sort of go away, have a little rest, and just get back in the fight, really. I mean, I don't know what else we can do except to keep raising the issues and keep pointing out the sort of the double standards. I mean, Israel will claim that there's all the left is always against Israel, you know, and one of its defenses is there are worse regimes than Israel? Like, that's a defense. So yeah, I was going to make some of the points that Jerry has covered about you know, the Ukrainian refugees, and exactly very, very similar point of view, really. Of course, we welcome Ukrainian refugees, and we had in this country, you know, Priti Patel, and now even worse, Suella Braverman, you know, saying things like, well, you don't like the Rwanda scheme, you know, sending people arriving on small boats, i.e. arriving illegally to Rwanda. Why don't you give us, you're not giving us any alternative, and everybody is going, so in fact, safe routes, safe legal routes. And in fact, a Tory MP challenged us, Suella Braverman, on, you said, imagine I'm a 16-year-old African boy from a war-torn country. What's my route? I've got relatives in the UK. What's my route for getting here? And she had no answer because she tried, you know. But so people are people, you know, as soon as you stop othering people, you know, Ukrainians, Russians, Palestinians, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, I'm a socialist because you know, they're very soppy. I'm actually someone who believes in love. And, you know, I know that's not necessarily, but actually I don't make distinctions about people. And I don't love I'm not active on the Palestinian cause, because some people will say things like, oh, the Palestinians are so lovely. And I go, well, I don't care if they're lovely or not. It's that their rights are being violated. And it's been proved time and time and time and time again on the basis of international law, which a lot of which, interestingly, was put in place to make sure that we didn't have another Nazi Holocaust or elements of it. And so there are rules in place around occupation, even if you have a justified occupation, which clearly it isn't. But even if you had it, there are rules of how you treat the civilian population, and they are being violated again and again and again on a daily basis. And to pick up on the media thing, if that's okay, I mean, of course, independent media, but getting the sort of coverage that the BBC and the Guardian and so on get is really, really difficult. But we have to at least have all those things. But yes, so we need the coverage, and we need to be making those comparisons about how different people are treated and why that's the case. In what geopolitical interests are Ukrainian refugees treated, frankly, with the respect that they deserve in escaping terrible bombardment and terrible treatment, and people coming from, I don't know, the Sudan aren't. And the Palestinians, it's like, well, you know, that's old, that their refugee status is so old now, we can't even count them as refugees, so they should just get used to living in the countries they've been sent to. And yet,
sorry,
that's not the law. That's not what international law says, you know.
Well, that's another discussion. Is there such a thing as international law? I know there's words written down, but it's only for the strong. There was a recent, very minor sporting event took place in Scotland. It was amputee football, very moving and very poignant, given the number of amputees in Palestine. Israel and the Israelis sent a team. We got in touch with a section of the Scottish Football Association who got back to us and said, sport should be kept out of football. Politics should be kept out of sport. I kid you not. Now, given what's happening in Qatar, what are your thoughts? Has the Ukrainian crisis, has the Qatar, has the international competition there, has it made it a bit easier to push for sports boycott? And does it at least take away that initial bogus hurdle that we have to keep politics out of sport? Jerry?
Say the last part of your question, Mick. Sorry, I got the sport reference, but your question.
Has it even just removed the first hurdle, the bogus one of keeping politics out of sport? I mean, they're still using it, they're taking it out again, having tucked it away for the last 6 months. But do you think it makes sporting boycott a little bit easier for us?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, these people have never watched sports before because politics is all around sports. You know what I mean? I'm when I get a chance to a follower of football, but obviously not as much as I like to. Not as much spare time as I used to have. But obviously politics is everywhere. In a good sense, sort of Black Lives Matter and players taking the knee, and a good important step. So elements of it kind of taken by the sort of the establishment to try and dampen down protests, but maybe that's more of a longer conversation. And obviously, in another way, sort of the poppy appeal. We have James McLean, who's originally from Derry. Is he at Wigan still, or he was at Wigan, I think, at some point. He refuses to wear a poppy every November time and is sort of castigated. I support what he did, but obviously, in a context where everybody, more or less, in sort of British football, is saying you have to wear a poppy, which is obviously not the position I would take, but also a very political decision. So obviously, sports, football in particular, but all sports are very, very political. We had a bit of a campaign targeting a football team in Belfast who. Last check had Puma as one of their sponsors in Cliftonville, a football team in North Belfast. Last I checked, they still were sponsored, but it was a bit of a campaign to kind of force them to remove Puma as a sponsor. So yeah, I think people are kind of taking politics in the sport and the football more generally, which is obviously a good thing. It's something that's always happened. Sports have always been, like I said, political. So I think we need to just kind of make sure those conversations are happening. And like you said, if there's examples of, I mean, there was the Israeli football team came to Windsor, which is a stone's throw away from my house, the Northern Ireland football team's stadium, and there was a protest of maybe a few hundred people in Belfast against that. And the cry at the time was that we should be weird examples about how we have came through troubles in the north, which people have, and the hard times, but we should not. We should export the lessons of the north and peace process to people in the Middle East and people in Palestine, which was bizarre for all sorts of reasons I don't have time to go into and tease out. But the point was made basically by powerful interests that we shouldn't be protesting against Israel, but people went ahead and did it. So I think if we can kind of continue that from the outside, and if there's a chance to kind of do so, we should, I think, jump upon it.
Thanks, Sherry. Liam, any thoughts?
Any thoughts? Yeah, I think all decisions around sport are political. I mean, allowing them to be sold to Russian oligarchs or any individual multimillionaire, that's a political decision. There used to be local clubs run for and in the interest of and by local people and footballers. There was a political decision to have footballers being paid, in professional games, being paid enormous sums of money. All of these things are political decisions. So why do they draw the line about, whatever they draw the line about? It's crazy. You cannot keep politics out of sport. Where they decide, FIFA make decisions about where to hold the tournaments. It's a political decision. I'm someone who believes that politics touches all of our lives, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing, I wish people would make more connections, frankly. So yeah.
Yeah, good point. I've got a couple more questions, if I may. One is, I mean, religion, of course, is part of the conversation. Israel claims to be a Jewish state. It's got massive support from Christian evangelicals, who actually raise very substantial sums of money in order to do stuff in Israel to try and make Jesus return. In Northern Ireland, of course, religious sectarianism shattered communities, goes right through communities, still walls. The founder of Northern Ireland Friends of Israel is a man called Ian Paisley. So religion's there, but I think we understand that underlying that there's a settler colonial dynamic, which in the case of Ireland has actually failed. The settler colonial project has failed and should be held up as an example of failure, at least to that extent. In Israel, it's a settler colonial project. Any religion can be used for oppression or for liberation, depending. Your comments, Jerry, and then Leah.
Sorry, your mic steady cutting off. You say, is religion used for oppression? Is that what your question? Yeah.
No, it's religion can be used for liberation or for oppression. What's your comments on the saturation of the conversation about Ireland and Israel about religion, whereas fundamentally, to understand it, you have to see it as species of settler colonialism? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I fundamentally agree. I kind of touched upon it in my initial comments, but they kind of expand upon it. It's obviously, it's sort of perverse in many ways. It's quite sort of reactionary to kind of present. I mean, I suppose in Ireland, it's quite, reactionary and probably racist in many ways. To present the sort of the Irish is always fighting amongst each other. Who'll never get on, and we're in an unruly type of bunch. And there's all sorts of racist connotations of saying that about people in Palestine and people in the Middle East. But obviously, really, what it does is it presents these sort of conflicts in inverted commas, as the liberal media present them as ones that have been happening for time immemorial. That they'll never be resolved. It's quite complex, and therefore, what you need is a nice arbiter, be it Britain, Ireland, or somebody like that, who obviously aren't neutral, and they're fundamentally the problem in sort of both these regions. So I think also what it does is it kind of ignores, downplays, massages, in some cases actually boosts the interest, the historical involvement of empires and imperialism and colonialism, which obviously, without the literal funding of the UVF in the early 20s, for example, it's very questionable whether the Northern State would be in existence at all. Bonner Law, former Prime Minister, supporting sort of any means of sort of loyalists effectively to fund the state, including armed resistance, pogroms, and all sorts of other things for Catholics being kicked out of shipyards. There's obviously an example there in terms of without the actions of Britain with Balfour and the British Mandate, and then subsequently the Americans in terms of funding Israel, it would not be able to exist, or certainly to exist on its sort of current basis. So I think those kind of conversations are, quite frustrating, those kind of comments in terms of presenting these kind of conflicts and as religiously based. Sorry, doesn't roll off tongue, religiously based, but also I think it purposefully downplays and ignores the role played by empire in fueling these displacements of people, these kind of reactionary governments and states to come into existence in the first place. And there's obviously powerful interests historically and today who want to avoid those kind of conversations. So it's our job to share about it as much as we can.
Thanks. Leah, your thoughts?
You mentioned Christian Zionism. I was going to originally, but I thought it would just take too long. I think it's, and I made some points in my opening remarks about the idea that Israel is a Jewish state, and I don't believe that it is. Quite apart from that I don't believe we should have Jewish states or Christian states or black states or white states. But that's a whole other conversation in itself. I think a few things are going on. First of all, Palestinians get labeled as Muslims. And so all the Islamophobia that exists in the West can get, they can be marginalized. Muslims are other in the UK and in the US. So they can be othered in the Middle East. And well, we can't do it for our friends in Saudi Arabia and so on, but we can for the Palestinians. It completely ignores the experience of Christian Palestinians. You remember the shock when I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten her name, but the journalist was murdered, and there was almost shock to see her being carried into a church to be buried, because it's like there was this equivalence of Palestinians are Muslims, and yet Christian Palestinians will tell you they have exactly the same experiences as they're Palestinians, and that's the issue. There is also something actually quite bizarre. If it was a genuine Jewish state, as in worried about Judaism, concerned about Judaism as a religion. I'm not a religious person, so I'm not an expert. But what I understand about Christian Zionism, fundamentalist evangelical Christians, is that they believe that everybody, all the Jews must go back to Israel, whatever they called it at the time, need to go back, and we need to convert to Christianity so that for the end times. And if we convert, we can join them in the great ascent up to heaven. And if we don't, we'll be damned into hell forever. Now, these don't sound like friends of Jews to me, but it does sound like friends of the Israeli state. So it's a distortion. It's nothing to, why would a Jewish person want to support Christian evangelicals? It is totally illogical. And it's a smokescreen for all the things that we've been discussing, and many more things that we know, the results of settler colonialism. As I said before, Israel is a state. It's a heavily militarized state, and it will do whatever it can do, whatever it needs to do in its eyes, to preserve itself as a heavily militarized state, because that's where it makes its money. People like the UK buying these at least ready tested surveillance systems, and that is actually just back to one of the original points about international things. That's one of the reasons it matters. We don't want to have heavy surveillance, and so we don't want it to be tested on anybody else. That's basic international solidarity. What's happening in China with face recognition and so on absolutely terrifies the life out of me, just as much as the surveillance that's happening to Palestinians. I don't think religion actually has very much to do with it. Quite honestly, it's a militarized state that, as all states, wants to be powerful, and that's what it's doing.
Thanks. Talking about surveillance, by the way, there is an Israeli military-grade surveillance system deployed in Glasgow city centre. It's been there since 2014, and it's got facial recognition and emotional recognition capabilities. It was installed as a pilot by the coalition government, and Glasgow won the competition to get the £25 million system installed. It can scan demonstrations, pick out individuals, relate that digital image immediately to their social media postings. That's another subject. My final question is this, folks. Look, there's a massive strike wave in Britain. The government promises nothing but austerity and war. They must whip up racism from their point of view. It has to be a tool in their toolbox. The fight against racism, against every victim of racism, is absolutely fundamental. What's the relationship between the fight against Israeli apartheid, state-enforced racism, and the general fight against racism in Britain and internationally? Jerry, do you want to answer that and make concluding remarks, and then I'll ask the same of Leah?
Sure, Mick, and thanks for having me again. I suppose that, we have a situation in the south of Ireland, in Dublin, an area called East Wall, where there's a bit of a sort of fabricated campaign, if you will, around refugees, black refugees. I'm not sure where they're originally from, what country. Basically, taking local facilities and local houses, and there's a bit of there's a lot of racism, obviously, in the campaign against it. A lot of kind of reference to Ukrainian refugees because they're seen to be okay because they're obviously white. And there's a kind of a whipped up hysteria by the mainstream Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael parties in the sense that
Sorry to interrupt you, Jerry. The Ukrainian refugees are temporarily okay, but in another situation they might have whipped up. Not too long ago, they were whipping up a lot of hatred against Eastern European refugees, or migrants, were they not?
Exactly. They're kind of the racism can shift from the far right, but they're obviously against everybody, including obviously Jewish people, even though they claim to stand with the Israeli state. So yeah, I can't remember the point I was making was there's a campaign there, and it's obviously the state is responsible in many ways because the governments of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael over many years have A, failed to invest in housing, but also B, overseen a system called direct provision where they lock up people who are seeking asylum in effectively it's hotels sort of being talked about in the UK and Ireland now, but it's far from hotels, and direct provision is no pretty picture. People can't cook for themselves on a few pound a day and treated abysmally. So that's obviously leading a situation where they have normalized from the top down. It's okay to treat people like this who may not initially be from Ireland, but should be extended, as we say in Ireland, Kedimila Falcha, 100,000 welcomes. They should be extended that, but they're being denied it by the state, and the far right are trying to use that to whip up racism about people coming into communities and all that kind of racist nonsense. And so that's a bit of a long-winded way to say we have these problems, obviously, in most countries, unfortunately. But I think what we need to be saying is, whether you're Syrian, Palestinian, Ukrainian, Irish, British, and you live on the island of Ireland, you deserve a home, access to work. Obviously, asylum seekers in Ireland and the UK aren't allowed access to work. They cannot work, even though they've got skills and assets and all the rest of it. And that principle should apply to anybody who's Palestinian, living in occupied territory or within the borders of Israel. They should be allowed to work. Many can't because they're obviously physically maimed by the state. Many can't because they're faced checkpoints, stuck on a checkpoint for hours. Many can't because of racist policy. So I think if we draw those kind of international lessons, sort of slogans, ideas for people in sort of countries we're based in, but extend that to people in Palestine, I think it makes sense, and also, say to those people who may be, taken by the sort of myths and the nonsense that there's limited resources in our countries, who may occasionally, often support the likes of Palestinian struggle, to say, listen, obviously it's people who are Palestinian and elsewhere who are refugee, and we need to be supporting every single one of them. So I think that is my answer to your question, Mick. And I just closing remarks would be, I think it's important to have these kind of events, and I'm happy to take part. And obviously any future events, me and our party would be happy to come along and join the conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. A few principles take you a long way, doesn't it, if you apply them firmly, clearly. Leah, your response. The fight against Israeli apartheid, like the fight against South African apartheid, and of course we all have to fight racism here in Britain and elsewhere. What's the relationship?
Well, I'm someone who thinks everything is interrelated, and we think, I mean, at the moment, it's not like racism didn't exist before, we had the refugees crisis from 2015 onwards, but it has been heightened. And I mean, just to remind you, I don't actually live in London. Everyone south of Scotland doesn't live in London. I actually live on the south coast, and some of the small boats have made it here. They've been blown off course. I mean, Hastings, and that means they've been blown off course. And if they come this far west when they're aiming for Dover. And I think it's worth noting that there is a huge amount of support for the refugees. In my little town, there is a whole network of people watching out for those boats, and then we swing into action. There's WhatsApp groups, and there are people landing, and there are people down there with warm clothes, because there's a whole warehouse full of stuff that's been donated. We keep sending. In fact, I'm going to go and help load a lorry on Saturday morning. Another one was loaded this morning to fill up to go to Calais. This is, we do hear about it, but most people, not everyone is active, but most people do recognize that they are, we are talking about human beings. Yes, there are racist people around. There are ignorant people around who are genuinely not understanding and believing the rhetoric, back to your media point from earlier on. Phenomenal amount of support, and not just from individual do-gooders, lefty people like me, but the businesses coming out with soup and taking them into their cafes if they can get there before the border people come. The police actually despairing on one occasion when the border patrols were actually circling the small boats as a discouragement, and the police saying, for goodness sake, send them here. They are freezing. They must be soaking wet, and let us process them. Then there's the other stuff about where they get put, as Jerry was saying, in these hotels, or in Napier Barracks or Manston in Kent. Absolutely despicable conditions for people, but that's not what most people want when they find out. So it matters, and it matters that we don't other people in the jargon, and that includes people in other countries, and that includes Indian children sleeping on the streets, like, oh, it's all right, they're used to it. It's ridiculous. We have to be concerned with it all. And we think about refugees because the politics around the climate, because of fossil fuels, etc., etc., etc. We're going to have more refugees. And if we don't find a way of supporting people, and similarly that we're in a housing crisis, and we're partly in a housing crisis. We're not in a housing crisis because we've had refugees from Hong Kong or Ukraine, or the people arriving in small boats because they don't have one of the legal routes of coming. We have a housing crisis because housing is seen as a commodity from which to make profits, rather than what's necessary to provide everybody with homes. And I'm a socialist, and I see these things as all related. It doesn't mean, magically we get a left Labour government, ha ha ha, if only, that everything would be solved. Far from it. But that's what we have to work towards. Not, I happen to have been born in this country. It's an accident of birth. It's an accident of birth that I was born Jewish. It's an accident of birth that I was born in London. And it was an accident of birth that I was born at a time when people in the UK got free education and even a maintenance grant, I'm a very old woman, to live on, and it's not like, how dare we pull the drawbridge up on that? My family came over. If the rules that were around now around refugees had been around when my family came, which was long pre-Holocaust, we would have been in there. We would have been caught up in the in the Holocaust. I wouldn't have existed, and we would probably be trying to cross in small boats from some other horrendous regime. And if we can't extrapolate from, and in the UK, phenomenal numbers of people reported have some sort of refugee or migrant. I know there's a difference, but some sort of escape from some sort of poverty or oppression. And if we can't generalize from that, if we can't extrapolate from that experience, I mean, as human beings, we should be able to be imaginative enough to do it. But if we can't take our own experience, our own family's experience, and go, what would they have been saying in 1890, 1920, whenever, it doesn't matter. I think that just incumbent on us as human beings to be humanitarian. And for me, that means love and socialism. And I know it sounds it sounds soppy because we're not used to that sort of thing. Everything's about fighting and opposition and actually what motivates me is love of human beings. And so everything connects.
Thank you, Leah, and a big thank you to both Leah and Jerry. It's been great to have you two tonight. The recording will be made available, but it's very stimulating. I really found it useful. Thanks a lot, folks. Two people from very different situations. People before profit in Belfast. Leah struggling. She's not a masochist, but she's struggling. I should have said probably the wrong thing.
I shouldn't say how relieved I was when I got expelled.
Trying to defend her rights inside very inhospitable terrain. The bloody Labour Party. It's a pleasure to have both of you. You're both heroic in different ways. My name's Mick Napier. I'll be back again on the 7th of December when we're doing another broadcast, this time on a pillar of Israeli apartheid, the ultra-racist Jewish National Fund. You know there's something dirty about it because Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are two patrons of the JNF in the UK. It's an engine of ethnic cleansing. But look, for this, the news from Palestine is pretty grim. My concluding remarks would be this. Despair is a luxury we can't afford. We'll save it for other times. Stories are already coming in from Hebron and elsewhere of brutal soldiers shouting at Palestinians, your time is coming up soon. Ben Gvir will impose order. He'll sort everybody out. You should all have been cleaned out in 48. Ben Gurion made a mistake. Ben Gvir will correct that. And the killing is spiking now as well, because on the ground, the very worst elements will take inspiration from Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu, of course. So what can we do? We have to fight back. This is a time we're alive. We have to build Palestine Solidarity movements in the broadest sense of the word, wherever we can. Palestine is actually a major domestic issue in Britain because of the attempts to shut us down. Criminal charges. Up here in Scotland, many criminal charges, which we won all of. Now in England and Wales against Palestine Action as well, which they are winning all of. They're winning all of them. So there's no room for despair because those who fight tend to win. Big thanks to the Palestine Return Centre. Share the recording, the video recording, if you think it's useful, and do tune in for the discussion on the 7th of December at the same time, 7 p.m. We will have Heidi Greenbaum from South Africa. She made a great film called The Village Under the Forest about the JNF's afforestation efforts to cover up a crime scene. And we'll also have Anne O'Gara from Stop the JNF UK and Khaloud Ajarma, whose family hails from the village of Ajur under the British Park. So we're trying to build international groups to work against the JNF by involving people from, say, Britain and the British Park. And we'll look at what the South Africans did with the South Africa forest, which covers over the ruins, the crime scene of the village of Lubia. Join me 7th of December, 7 p.m. for what will be a very interesting discussion with great guests. But once again, a big thanks to our guests, but a bigger thanks to all the people who joined us tonight to make this worthwhile. Thank you and good night.